Chapter 7 in Why Evolution is True by Jerry Coyne is explaining about the origin of species. So, the German zoologist Ernst Mayr in 1928 set off to the wilds of Dutch New Guinea to collect plants and animals. And when he was finished with his research, he had found a total of 136 different types of local birds names. Western zoologists that used taxonomy and traditional methods had also found 137 species. This helped show and also convince not just Mayer but also other people that nature is in fact discontinuous. However, this can be a problem for evolutionary theory. Since evolution is a continuous process, how can it be that groups of animals and plants can produce are discrete and discontinuous that are separated from either gaps of appearance or behavior? This arises the problem of speciation, or the origin of species. Since species don't just arise, as Darwin thought, and try to fill them up for empty niches, he had a lot to say about speciation in his book, The Origin of Species. He didn't see the discontinuities of nature as a problem. To be solved, he thought that these discontinuities could somehow be favored by natural selection, or he failed to explain how the clusters of different species in a coherent way. He did, however, try to figure out why single species changed over time, but never explained how a species could split into two different species. And that is somewhat of importance because all the diversity came from a single ancient ancestor for that species. And if you want to be able to explain the biodiversity, then you need to be able to explain how the traits arise for the species to be created into two different species. If there weren't any speciations, then there would be no biodiversity, and there would probably only be one single long evolved descendant from from the very first type of that type of species. Even years after The Origin was publicated, biologists still struggled to explain how the continuous process of evolution produces the discrete species. And the problem with speciation was that wasn't seriously addressed until around the mid 1930s. But now, in today, we have more of a type of complete picture on what species are and how they came from, and evidence to support this process. There are over 30 different types of species concept. One example is Mayer's described a species as the group of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. That is also known as the biological species concept. How species are recognized, again, there are many concepts on how species can be recognized. There are over 30 different concepts. Another example is the morphological species concept, where a group of individuals that resemble one another more than resemble another members of a different group. Linnaeus used this in 1735 to first classify a species. An example are tigers. If someone were to explain the species of a tiger by morphological species concept, they would describe them as large, wild Asian cats with the adult average size being about 5 feet tall, with vertical black stripes running throughout their bodies. A problem, however, with this concept is in dimorphic species, males and females can look very completely different. So based on just appearances, the male and females of one single species would be classified into two different species because of their looks. Another problem with this concept is also variation between interbreeding. An example is us humans. Human eyes have a wide range of colors, but using this morphological species concept, humans would be classified into many different species. For example, blue-eyed humans would be classified into as one type of species, while green-eyed humans would be classified into another, and then hazel-eyed could be classified into yet another species.
Hi, my name is Jacqueline Martinez, and I'll be talking about the biological species concept. So, species are distinct not merely because they look different, but because there are barriers between them that prevent inbreeding. As we know, inbreeding can lead to increase in homozygosity and an increase in genetic defects because your offspring's alleles look identical to your own. So I posted a picture of a royal family that were considered inbred, so they mated with their brothers, sisters, or mothers. And as you see, they're really hairy, they're short, they have unusual head shape, and it's because they're genetically identical and it created a lot of defects in their genome. Mayer defined a species as a group of inbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. This definition is known as the biological species concept. Now, you might ask yourself, what does reproductively isolated mean? Well, that means members of different species have traits that prevent them from inbreeding with one another, while members of the same species can breed. There are many examples of reproductive barriers, and let me tell you some. For instance, let's look at habitat isolation. So these two species of the family Gastroportidae, known as sticklebacks, one species live all year round in freshwater, mainly in small streams. The other species live in the sea during winter. But in the spring and summer, they migrate to the river to reproduce. The members of the two populations are reproductively isolated to their adaptations to distinct salt concentrations. So these two species are not able to reproduce. Now, let's look at behavioral isolation. For instance, fireflies have different mating rituals. So, a certain species of fireflies signal to their female counterparts by flashing their lights in specific pattern. Females will only respond to the signals flashed by their own species, preventing them from mating with any closely related species. Now, some species might reproduce, but it might not be genetically compatible. For instance, isolated barriers also can act after mating. Fetuses are formed, they might die before birth. This is what happens when you cross a sheep with a goat. Or even if the hybrid survives, they might be sterile or die before reproducing. That's natural selection at work. So, for instance, this is a sheep and goat. This species or this organism will probably be sterile. So, the biological species concept is pretty cool, right? It's pretty cool because it prevents any problems that appearance based concepts can't handle. But even though this biological species concept is pretty cool, it isn't bulletproof. It can't tell us about species that are extinct because we still have no real grasp about species that existed and are now extinct. Thank you.
Hi, I'm going to talk about symmetric speciation. The definition is a new species evolved from a single ancestral population, which came from the same geographic area. For example, they all came with a original population, which is the ancestral population, and goes through the period of time. There's a new types or forms of phenotype or discontinuative genetic variation occurs in the population, which cause reproduction, and within the population, so will be one new speciation will be occur with the original speciation, actually, which is called sympatric speciation. Actually, polyploid speciation is arise from sympatric speciation, actually. So today we're going to talk about the first type, which is allopolyploid speciation. The definition is when two species mate with each other, they reproduce hybrid offsprings, and the possible hybrid can cause chromosome numbers of each species different from each other. And it also can cause no reproduction with parental populations, which is the fertile populations. The fertile populations can form later with other hybrid matings events, or it can result in errors in cells division, actually. So the example I gave is wheat and crops. For example, the wheat pollens can escape from farmland and form sympatric hybrid with local wild plants in the same genus, which makes the example as allopolyploid speciation. Second type of the speciation is autopolyploidy. The definition of it is which is doubling all of the chromosome in a single species, which can result in a new species because autopolyploids can produce fertile hybrids when mating with other autopolyploids, but they only can produce sterile hybrids when mating with the original parental species. For example, potatoes. Because potatoes are asexual plant, so they can produce by itself by using part of their parental species, actually. In the conclusion, polyploid different from other speciations because it can change the number of chromosomes instead of involving in changing genes. Secondly, it also immensely faster than normal geographic speciation because a new polyploid can arise into generations. With the polyploids arise in nature and derive from other speciation, it actually led us to arise as a population that involves incipient reproductive barriers, which means barriers are the foundation of the speciation.